Life here is pretty idyllic, tree-lined streets, neighbors who wave as they water their lawns, and just enough space to feel like you're in your own world but not completely isolated. I'm even a 43-year-old mechanical engineer living in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado. 16 years ago, I married Alice, the love of my life. Or so I thought. We have two incredible kids, Lily, a whip-smart 14-year-old who already debates like a lawyer in training, and Noah, a curious 9-year-old who's determined to either become an astronaut or the next big YouTuber, depending on the week. I won't lie, my life used to feel like a Hallmark commercial. Our mornings started with the smell of Alice's coffee brewing, Lily chattering about her school drama while Noah half-listened, glued to his tablet. Weekends were for soccer games, barbecues, and the occasional road trip to the Rockies. It was good. Too good, maybe. Because looking back, I realize I missed the signs. Alice had changed. And I was too busy holding on to my idea of perfect to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface. Alice works as a financial analyst for a mid-sized firm downtown. I've always been proud of her career, even when it meant late nights or early meetings. But in the last 6 months, her dedication started feeling off. She'd come home later and later, using terms like big quarterly pushes or client dinners as her shield. The sparkle in her eye when she'd talk about work was no longer about her job, it was about her boss, Richard. Richard was everything I wasn't. A polished, high-powered executive who seemed to have stepped out of a Forbes magazine cover shoot. The first time I met him at her company's Christmas party, I thought he was just charming. Alice raved about him for weeks after. I dismissed it as professional admiration, but it wasn't long before the comparisons began. "You should meet Richard sometime, Ethan," she said one night after a particularly heated PTA meeting I had chaired. "He's just so charismatic. He handles pressure like it's nothing." It stung, but I shrugged it off. Marriage is full of little digs, I told myself. But the digs started piling up. It all came to a head on a chilly Wednesday night in February. Alice had been gone since dawn, supposedly working late at an off-site meeting. By 9 p.m., I was pacing the living room, trying to focus on Noah's science project about the phases of the moon. Lily, ever the perceptive teenager, shot me a knowing look. "Mom working late again?" she asked, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Yeah," I replied absently. But something in her voice made me pause. "Dad, don't you think it's weird? She's never around anymore." That was the first crack in my denial. After tucking the kids into bed, I poured myself a glass of bourbon and sat in silence, scrolling through our family photos on my phone. Smiles frozen in time, all of us looking so happy. But were we really? If you've ever been in a long-term relationship, you know how easy it is to fall into routines. You stop noticing little things because, well, life gets busy. That's why, when Alice started acting differently, I wasn't sure if it was something to celebrate or something to worry about. It began subtly. Alice, who usually breezed through dinner prep with a can of soup and frozen vegetables, suddenly started making home-cooked meals. We're talking lasagnas, pot roasts, and even her grandmother's chicken pot pie recipe, the one she swore she'd never try because it was too much work. I'll admit, at first, I enjoyed it. It felt like a revival of the Alice I fell in love with, thoughtful, present, and warm. She even suggested we take a family road trip to Yellowstone, something we hadn't done since Lily was in preschool. But as much as I wanted to believe she was reconnecting with us, something about it felt off. The first time I noticed her uneasiness was during dinner one Thursday night. Noah was cracking up about something silly, probably a joke from YouTube, and Alice's phone buzzed. Her laughter froze mid-chuckle, and she snatched her phone so quickly you'd think it was a winning lottery ticket. "What's that about?" I asked casually, trying not to sound accusatory. "Oh, just a reminder from work," she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. But she didn't look at me. Later that week, I woke up around 2 a.m. to grab some water. On my way back to bed, I saw a faint glow coming from the living room. There she was, curled up on the couch, typing furiously on her phone. I didn't confront her, I figured it was probably work-related. But as I walked back to bed, a tiny voice in my head whispered, "You sure about that?" Alice started showing other signs of restlessness, too. She'd zone out during conversations, her eyes glazing over as though she were somewhere far away. Once, while watching our favorite sitcom, she suddenly turned to me and said, "Ethan, do you think people can change? Like, really change?" "Sure," I replied, thinking it was just a philosophical musing. "Why? Are you trying to reinvent yourself as a morning person?" I joked, trying to keep things light. She smiled weakly, but her eyes didn't. "No reason. Just curious," she said, turning back to the TV. That's when I started to worry. Not in the she's cheating way, not yet, at least. My mind went to the worst-case scenarios. Did she find a lump? Was she hiding a diagnosis? I even Googled signs your spouse is hiding an illness late one night. The tipping point came one evening about a month later. I'd been working late, and by the time I got home, the house was quiet. I found Alice sitting in the dim light of the living room, her knees pulled up to her chest. She had a book in her hands, something I hadn't seen her read before. "What's that?" I asked, gesturing to the book. She jumped slightly, not realizing I was there. "Oh, it's nothing," she said, wiping her eyes quickly. But the title was unmistakable, How to Make Amends After Hurting the One You Love. My heart sank. I didn't ask her about it right then. I mean, what was I supposed to say? "Hey, hon, planning on hurting me soon?" Instead, I sat next to her on the couch, silently offering comfort. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and we just sat there, listening to the sound of the heater kicking on and off. But in that quiet moment, my mind raced. What was she feeling guilty about? And why did it feel like she was trying to repair something that, as far as I knew, wasn't even broken? The next morning, I decided I couldn't let it go. I didn't want to accuse her of anything, I still trusted her. But I needed to understand what was going on. "Hey," I started over breakfast, trying to sound casual, "everything okay? You seemed a little emotional last night." Alice looked up from her coffee, startled. "Oh, it's nothing. Just some personal stuff I've been working through." I nodded, giving her space to open up if she wanted to. But she didn't. She just smiled and said, "Thanks for asking, though," before changing the subject to Noah's soccer schedule. I never imagined I'd be the kind of person who hires a private investigator. That sort of thing always seemed like a plot device for movies or soap operas, not something a regular guy like me would ever need. But there I was, standing in the dimly lit office of Sam, the private investigator I found online. Sam was an older guy, probably in his late 50s, with a gruff demeanor and a no-nonsense attitude. His office smelled faintly of stale coffee, and the walls were lined with framed newspaper clippings about his career highlights. "So, you think your wife's having an affair?" he asked bluntly, leaning back in his creaky chair. I hesitated. "I don't know. Things don't add up lately. She's distant, spending more time at work. And there's this guy, her boss, Richard. I don't want to jump to conclusions, but..." He nodded, scribbling in a notebook. "I'll tell her, see what comes up. 2 weeks should be enough to get a clear picture." While Sam did his thing, I started paying closer attention at home. It wasn't exactly spying, at least that's what I told myself. But I started noticing the little things I'd overlooked before. Alice's phone was always within arm's reach. She used to leave it on the kitchen counter or forget it in her car, but now it was like an extension of her hand. She'd laugh at texts, her face lighting up in a way that hadn't happened in months, maybe years. And then there was her wardrobe. She'd always been stylish, but suddenly there were new clothes. Sleek dresses, high heels, even lingerie I'd never seen before. I asked her about it once. "Oh, just a few things for work," she said, brushing it off. "We've been having more formal events lately." It made sense at the time. But looking back, it was just another piece of the puzzle I hadn't put together yet. 2 weeks later, Sam called me into his office. He slid a folder across the desk without a word. My stomach churned as I opened it, revealing a series of photos. There was Alice, stepping out of a car outside a fancy downtown restaurant. Across from her stood Richard, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. Another photo showed them laughing over wine at a candlelit table. And then there was the clincher, a shot of them entering a hotel together late at night. "She's been seeing him regularly," Sam said, breaking the silence. "Always the same pattern. Dinner, drinks, and then they head to the hotel." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't know whether to feel anger, sadness, or both. But even in that moment, part of me still wanted to believe there was an explanation. I told myself I needed more proof. Maybe Richard was manipulating her, or maybe it wasn't as serious as it looked. But a few days later, I stumbled upon something that shattered any illusions I had left. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Alice had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was outside gardening. I'm not proud of what I did, but curiosity got the better of me. I unlocked her phone, she'd never changed the passcode, and started scrolling through her photos. Most of it was harmless. Pictures of the kids, screenshots of recipes, selfies in her new outfits. But then I saw it, a photo of Alice at a beach. She was smiling, carefree, her hair blowing in the wind. Beside her was a young man, maybe in his early 20s. At first, I thought he was just a random coworker or a friend's son. But then I recognized him. It was Michael, Richard's son. I couldn't process it. What was Alice doing at a beach with Richard's son? Were they on some family outing? But why wouldn't she tell me? And then a darker thought crept in. Was it more than that? That night, I couldn't look at Alice the same way. Every smile she gave me felt fake, every word she said felt like a lie. I didn't confront her right away, I didn't even know where to start. Instead, I decided to wait, to gather more information. The days that followed were torture. I played the role of the clueless husband, but inside I was a storm of anger, hurt, and confusion. I needed to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. When I decided to confront Richard, I didn't expect much. What do you even say to the man who might be wrecking your marriage? But I needed answers, desperately. So, I called his office under the guise of discussing a sensitive family matter. He agreed to meet after work at a bar downtown, probably thinking it was something minor or professional. The bar wasn't exactly private, but it wasn't crowded either. Dim lighting, jazz playing softly in the background, and a hum of quiet conversation made it a decent spot for a confrontation. I arrived early, nursing a whiskey as I tried to calm my nerves. When Richard walked in, he spotted me immediately. He wasn't the type to blend into a crowd. Tall, sharply dressed in a tailored suit, and exuding the kind of confidence that made people stand up straighter when he entered a room. "Ethan," he said, extending a hand. "Thanks for reaching out. What's on your mind?" I didn't beat around the bush. "Richard, I know about you and Alice." His smile faltered for just a second before he composed himself. He sighed, took a seat across from me, and motioned to the bartender for a drink. "I won't insult your intelligence by denying it," he said, leaning back. His casual admission caught me off guard. I had expected excuses, maybe even anger. But here he was, calm as ever, like we were discussing a business deal. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Why go after a married woman?" Richard took a long sip of his drink before answering. "Ethan, it wasn't planned. Alice is incredible. Smart, beautiful, funny. We connected on a level that's rare. But I swear to you, it wasn't about destroying your marriage." I scoffed. "Well, congratulations. You've done a hell of a job keeping it intact." He winced, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "Look, I won't sugarcoat it. I messed up. But Alice loves you. She talks about you all the time, how devoted you are to your family, how good you are to your kids. She'd never leave you, Ethan. What we had was temporary." That word, temporary, stung. Like my marriage was some side project Alice took a break from. But it was what he said next that really threw me. I'm telling you this because I respect you, Richard continued. And I want to make things right. Alice and I ended things weeks ago. She made it clear that her family comes first. Whatever happened between us is over. I stared at him, letting his words sink in. Weeks ago? Then why was Alice still acting so off? And then it hit me. Michael. I debated whether to say anything. But the image of that photo, the carefree smile, the sandy beach, flashed in my mind. Richard, I said carefully, did you know Alice has been spending time with someone else? His brow furrowed. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table, showing him the photo of Alice and Michael. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to something that almost resembled heartbreak. That's my son, he said quietly. I leaned back, watching as the realization dawned on him. For a moment, he looked human. Vulnerable. Not the confident, untouchable boss I had imagined. Ethan, he said after a long pause, I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know. I believed him. His reaction wasn't the kind you could fake. Richard, I said, my voice steady, I didn't come here to make you feel bad. I just needed to know the truth. But let me be clear, this mess? It's bigger than you realize. And I don't think anyone's walking away from it unscathed. He nodded slowly, clearly grappling with the implications. As I stood to leave, he called out, Ethan, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Sorry, I wasn't going to fix anything. I walked out of the bar, leaving Richard alone with his drink and the weight of what he'd just learned. On the drive home, I couldn't shake the image of Richard's face when he saw the photo. He wasn't just a man who had made a mistake, he was a father realizing his son was part of something he couldn't control. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that he was suffering, too. But another part of me wondered, if Richard didn't know, how much did Alice know about what she was doing? The lines were blurring, and the more I tried to untangle them, the messier it got. For now, I had more questions than answers. But one thing was certain, this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. When the cracks in your marriage start to widen, you tell yourself it can't get worse. But somehow, it always does. After my meeting with Richard, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. Alice's affair with him was bad enough, but at least he'd assured me it was over. I was ready to start picking up the pieces, until I uncovered something that made everything else look trivial. It started with a hunch. Richard's reaction to the photo of Alice and Michael had been genuine, but it left too many questions unanswered. Why was Alice spending time with Michael at all? And what did Michael, barely out of college and seemingly innocent, have to do with any of this? I decided to dig deeper. Over the next few weeks, I quietly gathered information. Alice's routine hadn't changed much, still the late nights, still the guarded phone behavior. But now, there were more clues to follow. One night, I noticed her laptop open on the kitchen counter. She was in the shower, and her email was logged in. I hesitated, my conscience warring with my curiosity. But the need to know outweighed the guilt. At first, there was nothing unusual, work emails, promotions from stores, reminders from Lily's school. But then, I found a folder labeled personal. Inside, there was an email thread between Alice and Michael. The subject line? Financial updates. The emails were a gut punch. In one, Michael was asking Alice for details about transferring funds from his father's family trust into an account she had set up. In another, Alice was reassuring him that everything would be fine as long as they stuck to the plan. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. This wasn't just an affair, it was a scheme. Alice wasn't just betraying me, she was manipulating Michael, exploiting his naivety to steal from Richard's family. The final email in the chain was the most damning. It was dated just 3 days ago. Alice had written, "Once the transfer is complete, we'll both have the freedom we've been talking about. Don't worry about your dad, he'll never trace it back to us. Michael wasn't the kind of guy you'd expect to get involved in something like this. I'd seen him at a few company events, and he always seemed like the quiet, reserved type. A little awkward, maybe, but harmless. Richard had mentioned once, in passing, that Michael was a work in progress. He'd struggled to find his footing after college, bouncing between jobs and relying on his family's wealth to stay afloat. That kind of aimlessness made him a perfect target for someone like Alice. And Alice? She had always been sharp, ambitious, and persuasive. If anyone could convince Michael to go along with a scheme like this, it was her. For a few days, I kept the emails to myself. I wasn't sure what to do. Confronting Alice felt like walking into a minefield, but staying silent wasn't an option either. I decided to approach Michael first. I figured he'd be easier to crack, and maybe, just maybe, he didn't fully understand what he'd gotten himself into. We met at a coffee shop near the University of Denver, where he was supposedly taking night classes. Michael looked nervous when I approached him, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact. "Michael," I said, sitting across from him. "We need to talk." He swallowed hard. "About what?" I didn't mince words. "About Alice. And the money." His face went pale. For a moment, I thought he might bolt, but he stayed put. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. I pulled out my phone and showed him screenshots of the emails. His eyes widened in shock, and he leaned back in his chair, looking like a deer caught in headlights. "She said it was just temporary," he blurted out. "She said it was to help her get out of a bad situation." I stared at him, my anger simmering just below the surface. "Michael, do you even understand what you've done? You're helping her steal from your own father." He shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't know it was this serious. I thought she loved me." Hearing those words, I almost felt sorry for him. Alice had played him just as much as she'd played me. She'd used her charm and his insecurity to pull him into her scheme, and now he was in over his head. "Michael," I said, my tone firm but not unkind, "you need to fix this. Go to your father. Tell him everything before it's too late." He nodded, but I wasn't sure I believed him. People don't always do the right thing, especially when they're scared. Deciding to tell Richard the truth wasn't easy. I went back and forth about it for days. Part of me felt like it wasn't my place, this was his family, his mess. But another part of me, the part that couldn't stand by while more people got hurt, knew he had to know. So, one evening, while the kids were at a sleepover and Alice was out working late, I sat down at my desk with the damning photo of Alice and Michael at the beach. I attached it to an email with no subject line and typed a single sentence. "Do you really know what's going on in your family?" I created a throwaway email account, sent it to Richard, and logged out. Then, I poured myself a drink and waited. It didn't take long for Richard to respond. Less than 48 hours later, I got a text from Michael. "Dad is freaking out. Did you say something to him?" I didn't reply. I wanted to, but this wasn't Michael's moment to spin things in his favor. Whatever Richard had discovered, he needed to confront Alice on his own terms. The confrontation happened sooner than I expected. Richard called Alice to his office the next day. From what I heard later, the meeting wasn't anything like the calm, controlled demeanor he usually presented at work. Richard had printed the photo and laid it out on his desk. When Alice walked in, he slid it across the table toward her without a word. "What's this?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. "You tell me," he replied, his voice ice-cold. Alice froze, her face paling as she realized what she was looking at. "Richard, I can explain." "Explain what, Alice?" he snapped, his voice rising. "That you've been sleeping with my son behind my back? That you've used both of us for your little schemes?" "It's not like that," she stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way." Richard laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You didn't mean for it to happen? Do you think that makes it better? You've destroyed two families, Alice. Yours and mine. And for what? By this point, Alice was in tears. Richard, I was under so much pressure. Between my job, my marriage, I felt like I was suffocating. He was just a way to escape for a while. Escape? Richard spat. You call manipulating my son and stealing from me an escape? Do you even hear yourself? I didn't think it would go this far, she sobbed. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted something for myself. Richard slammed his fist on the desk, silencing her. Well, congratulations, Alice. You got what you wanted. But now you've lost everything. That night, I heard everything secondhand. Michael called me, his voice trembling as he recounted the argument between his father and Alice. Dad told her to pack her things and never come back to the office, Michael said. He's cutting her off completely, no severance, no references. Nothing. I nodded, even though Michael couldn't see me. Good, I said simply. What about me? He asked, his voice small. You have a chance to make this right, I told him. Go to your dad. Be honest. Own up to your part in this mess. There was a long pause before Michael whispered, I don't think he'll ever forgive me. He might not, I admitted. But at least you'll know you tried. A few days later, Richard reached out to me directly. He called in the evening, his voice calm but strained. Ethan, he began, I know you're the one who sent the photo. I didn't bother denying it. You deserve to know, I said simply. There was a pause before he replied, thank you. I don't know what I would have done if this had gone on any longer. I wish it didn't have to be this way, I said. So do I, he admitted. But at least now I can start rebuilding. For what it's worth, I'm sorry for everything Alice put you through. After the call ended, I sat in the quiet of my living room, staring out the window at the neighborhood I used to see as my haven. Everything felt different now, darker, more fragile. But there was also a strange sense of closure. Richard knew the truth. Michael was facing the consequences. And Alice? Well, she had made her choices. Now she had to live with them. As for me, I wasn't sure what came next. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally free to figure it out. Richard and I both knew that exposing the truth wasn't just about revenge, it was about putting an end to the lies and manipulation. After days of planning, we decided on a family meeting at Richard's home. It would be a controlled environment, with everyone present, Alice, Michael, Richard's wife Natalie, and their other children. The meeting was set for a Saturday afternoon, a time when there would be no excuses about work or other obligations. Richard's home, a sprawling house in Cherry Hills Village, was the perfect setting. It was neutral ground for me, but it also carried the weight of authority from Michael and Alice. I arrived early to go over the plan with Richard. The dining room was set up like a courtroom, documents and photos laid out neatly on the table, ready for presentation. Natalie, unaware of the full scope of the situation, looked anxious but determined to support her husband. When Alice and Michael arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Michael looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot, while Alice tried to maintain her usual composure. Richard wasted no time. Thank you for coming, he began, his voice firm. We're here today to address some serious issues that have been brought to my attention. Michael's face went pale, and Alice immediately shot me a glance, as if she already suspected my involvement. Richard started by laying out the evidence, the emails, the financial discrepancies, and finally, the photo of Alice and Michael at the beach. Michael, Richard said, his voice laced with disappointment, you told me you were focused on night classes and getting their life together. Instead, you were involved in this. He gestured toward the incriminating photo. Michael stammered, Dad, it's not what it looks like. Alice needed help, and I. Help? Richard interrupted, his voice rising. You call stealing from your own family and betraying my trust help? How could you do this? Alice, for her part, tried to interject. Richard, please, let me explain. But he silenced her with a sharp look. You've done enough, Alice. This isn't just about your betrayal of Ethan. You've manipulated my son, my family, and my finances. Did you honestly think you'd get away with it? Under the weight of his father's anger and the mounting evidence, Michael finally broke. It was all her idea, he blurted out, tears streaming down his face. She said we weren't doing anything wrong, that it was just a temporary thing to help her get out of a bad situation. I didn't know it would come to this. Alice gasped, her composure cracking for the first time. Michael, don't do this. You're making it sound worse than it is. Richard slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. Worse than it is? Alice, you've destroyed trust that can never be rebuilt. Do you even understand what you've done to this family? To Ethan's? For most of the meeting, Natalie had been silent, her face a mix of shock and sadness. But now, she stood up, addressing both Alice and Michael. You've not only hurt your own families, but you've dragged all of us into your mess, she said, her voice trembling. Richard and I have worked hard to build something meaningful for our children, and now you've jeopardized all of it. Turning to Alice, she added, I hope you understand that your actions have consequences far beyond what you can see right now. The meeting ended with no resolution, only raw emotions and shattered relationships. Alice and Michael left separately, both looking defeated. Richard and Natalie stayed behind to discuss how they would handle the financial fallout and their family's reputation. For me, it felt like a hollow victory. The truth was out, but the damage was irreversible. In the weeks that followed, Alice tried to piece her life back together. She moved out of our home and into a small apartment closer to her therapist's office. Her job at Richard's company was, of course, over. One evening, she came by to see the kids. After they went to bed, she sat across from me at the kitchen table, her eyes red from crying. Ethan, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I know I've destroyed everything. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want to do what's right for Lily and Noah. They deserve better. I looked at her, searching for sincerity. Alice, I don't know if I can ever forgive you, I admitted. But if you're serious about changing for the kids, then start proving it. Be there for them. Show them that you can be better. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I will. I promise. The road ahead wasn't easy for any of us. Alice began intensive therapy and started volunteering at a local shelter, trying to rebuild her sense of purpose. The kids and I worked to find a new normal, leaning on each other for support. It was a crisp October morning when Richard and Natalie finally sat down to talk in their sunlit breakfast nook. The house, with its tall windows and immaculate decor, felt unnaturally quiet without their usual bustling family life. Natalie had spent the last few weeks avoiding Richard, trying to process everything in her own way. Natalie, Richard began, his voice heavy with guilt, I know I've failed you. I failed to protect our family, and I let things spiral out of control. She looked at him, her eyes filled with both sadness and resolve. Richard, this isn't just about you. It's about trust. And once that's gone, it's nearly impossible to get back. He nodded, his gaze dropping to his coffee cup. I want to fix this, for us. For our family. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. But Natalie shook her head. I've thought about it, Richard. I've replayed everything over and over in my mind. And the truth is, I can't move past this. I need to rebuild my life, for me, for our other kids. I can't do that while staying here, pretending everything is okay. Their divorce was amicable but somber. Natalie moved into a townhouse closer to her sister's family, bringing their youngest daughter with her. Richard stayed behind, focused on repairing what was left of his relationship with Michael. Life continued after I moved out, but it wasn't the same. I wasn't prepared for how quiet my new apartment would feel or how much I'd miss the simple chaos of home. Even the noise of Noah complaining about homework or Lily begging for extra screen time had a strange comfort to it. One evening, as I sat on the couch eating a reheated frozen meal, my phone buzzed. It was Alice, sending a picture of Noah holding up his latest science project, a model of the solar system. Alice, he wanted to show you first. He says you be proud. Me, tell him I am. It looks amazing. Can I call him? We ended up FaceTiming for 20 minutes. Noah excitedly explained how he'd used toothpicks for the planet connectors, while Lily teased him from off camera. Alice didn't say much, but I caught her reflection in the window behind Noah. She looked tired, more than I'd ever seen her before. After hanging up, I stared at the darkened screen, wrestling with a mix of emotions. Part of me longed to go back, to pretend none of this had happened. But the larger part of me knew that wasn't possible. Meanwhile, Richard was dealing with his own fallout. We had kept in touch sporadically since the family meeting. He'd call every so often to vent or update me on his progress with Michael. One afternoon, he invited me out for coffee. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, far from the corporate buzz of his usual haunts. Michael's back in therapy, Richard said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. He's trying, but there's a lot to unpack. I'm trying to be patient, but it's hard. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. Have you talked to Natalie? Richard sighed. She's moving on. She deserves to, I guess. But I can't help wondering if things could have been different. If I had paid more attention, seen the signs earlier, maybe this wouldn't have happened. I leaned forward. You can't blame yourself for their choices, Richard. People do what they do, and sometimes, no amount of vigilance can stop it. He looked at me, a faint smile playing on his lips. Wise words. You should follow them yourself. A few weeks later, I picked the kids up for a weekend at my apartment. We'd planned a movie night, complete with popcorn and all the sugary snacks Alice wouldn't allow. As we were settling in, Lily turned to me, her face serious. Dad, are you ever coming back home? The question caught me off guard. I glanced at Noah, who was already engrossed in his tablet, and then back at Lily. Why do you ask, sweetheart? She shrugged. Mom's been different. She tries really hard, but I can tell she's sad. And you seem sad, too. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Lily, sometimes people need time apart to figure things out. It doesn't mean we don't love you or Noah. And it doesn't mean we're not a family. Things are just different right now. She nodded slowly, but I could tell she wasn't fully satisfied with my answer. Alice's transformation was undeniable. She was at every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every recital. She even started coaching Noah's little league team, a role I would have never imagined her taking on. One evening, she called me. Ethan, I know it's not my place to ask, but would you like to come to Noah's game this Saturday? He's been asking if you'll be there. Of course, I said without hesitation. When Saturday arrived, I showed up early and found Alice helping Noah adjust his cap on the field. She looked up and smiled when she saw me, the genuine warmth I hadn't seen in years. Thanks for coming, she said softly as I approached. Wouldn't miss it, I replied, watching Noah run off to join his team. For the first time in a long time, we stood side by side, cheering for our son like we used to. It felt normal. And that scared me. Around this time, Natalie reached out to me. She and Richard had finalized their divorce, and she was adjusting to her new life in her townhouse. Do you ever wonder if forgiveness is worth it? She asked one afternoon as we walked through a park near her home. All the time, I admitted. But do you think it's possible? She pressed. I hesitated. I think forgiveness is more about letting go of the anger than forgetting what happened. But forgetting? That's the hard part. She nodded, looking thoughtful. Maybe forgetting isn't the point. Maybe it's about finding a way to live with the memories without letting them control you. Her words stuck with me long after we parted ways. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, Alice and I found ourselves alone in the backyard. I had stopped by to drop off some things, but the cool night air had lured me to stay. Ethan, she began, breaking the silence, do you think there's ever a chance we could start over? I looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. Alice, I don't know, I want to say yes for the kids' sake, but trust, it's not something you can just rebuild overnight. I know, she said quickly. And I'm not asking for anything right now. I just wanted to know if you'd be willing to try. Someday. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked up at the stars, thinking about all we'd been through. Someday, I said finally. Maybe. Months turned into a year. Slowly, life began to stabilize. Lily started high school, excelling in debate and journalism. Noah, ever the dreamer, finally settled on becoming an engineer like Dad. As for me, I found peace in my new routine. I took up woodworking, spending hours in my small garage-turned workshop crafting everything from picture frames to furniture. It was therapeutic, a way to channel my emotions into something tangible. Alice continued her efforts, showing up for the kids and making amends in every way she could. While we weren't a couple anymore, we found a rhythm that worked, a partnership rooted in shared love for our children. One sunny afternoon, as I dropped the kids off at Alice's, I lingered by the car, watching them play in the yard. Alice joined them, her laughter echoing through the air as she chased Noah with a foam sword. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. Maybe this was enough, a different kind of family, but a family nonetheless. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the foundation for something new.